It was just getting light out.
Alaska's beauty tested by Mother Nature.
We were camping on a remote island on Harbor Island.
August 10th, 2025.
I don't even know how to describe the sound. It was just like this rumbling.
The first clue something was off came from the water itself.
The ocean that day looked as if you had picked up a tray of water and been sloshing it back and forth. I saw logs flying by the boat at about 10 knots, and then I looked up and I saw a wave coming.
The sandbar that we were anchored behind had a lot of water coming over it in a way that was very unusual.
There was some water coming underneath the vestibule of our tent.
Scientists were left racing to figure out what happened in the fjord south of Juneau.
We are confident that it was a large landslide from just by looking at the seismic data.
The tide gauge around Juneau picked up a tsunami of approximately a foot.
Then, pinpointing the exact location and extent, confirmed to be Tracy Arm.
The landslide just sheared that part of the glacier right off.
An area now known for the natural disaster that forever altered the fjord's anatomy.
You couldn't miss the big chunk of the mountain that had fallen off.
The massive landslide triggering a mega tsunami.
You could see the trim line where how high up the water had run as you went down the fjord.
The nearly 1,600-foot run-up, making the wave the world's second tallest tsunami.
You know how cats have 9 lives, that we may have used up one of our 9 lives.
There was a large landslide that triggered the tsunami and no one was unluckily harmed. Like we're lucky that no one was injured.
No one injured this time, but we've seen this before with a harsher outcome.
He charged into the wave with the boat because his anchor was hung up on the bottom.
2 were killed in the world's tallest tsunami in Lituya Bay in 1958, 4 others miraculously surviving.
My father knew them, of course. They were all fishermen.
And there are other landslides lurking on the cliff sides, slowly sliding toward the deep bodies of water.
You see a glacier retreats, then seems to stabilize, then retreats again. This happened with Barry Arm. This is happening right now with Portage Glacier.
Known and unknown.
I think if we are focused on just a few sites, that we're likely to over and over again be looking at the wrong ones, because these things are pretty hard to predict.
A common theme coming to light in Alaska.
But I do feel like we've gotten awful lucky, and depending on continuing to get lucky is not a good idea.
As scientists and lawmakers look to address concerns.
I think everything that we can do to, again, better understand the conditions that are bringing about more of these deadly and destructive landslides, so that we can be better prepared. Everything that we can do for that is important.
This episode of The Fault in the Facts dives into the latest landslide to make big waves in Alaska and what scientists want to know about the ever-growing and constantly melting threat of retreating glaciers leading to massive landslides in Alaska. Volcanoes, earthquakes, glaciers, and tsunamis. All a part of Alaska's geology. Mother Nature's natural hazards explained. It's happened again. 84 million cubic yards of mountainside left unsupported after a glacier retreated came crashing down into deep fjord waters in August 2025, causing what scientists called a mega tsunami in Tracy Arm south of Juneau. It was about 150 feet shorter than the tsunami with the tallest run-up ever recorded. And it's not the only landslide lurking on Alaska's coastline, as scientists work to understand the hazard coming from retreating glaciers, leaving fjord walls unsupported over deep water. This natural disaster was one that could have taken lives, and luck may be the reason no one was injured. This situation and others like it are uncommon, but they are important to talk about so you can make informed decisions about the risk you are willing to take while recreating in Alaska's backcountry. Being in the path of a tsunami is an experience no one wants to endure. In this case, multiple people who were just miles away as Mother Nature unleashed one of her most powerful forces lived to tell their tale. And it's a story of the right place at the right time. Multiple survivors saying luck or an unknowing decision was the saving grace to what could have been hundreds of lives. 3 boats and a group of kayakers were in the general vicinity of Tracy Arm when the mountainside let go.
It was kind of foggy and kind of rainy.
Christine Smith and the crew and passengers on the MV David B were the furthest of the 4 groups.
We're in offshoot of Endicott Arm in Ford's Terror.
Anchoring the evening before, miles from the original plan.
We had originally planned to be in Tracy Arm that night, but we're wanting to take our passengers through the Narrows at Ford's Terror.
Sasha Calvi and her 2 kayaking buddies were the next closest.
We were camping on a remote island on Harbor Island.
They also hadn't planned to be there that night.
The day before, we actually took a day off because it was raining 3 inches of rain that day, and it was very wet, and we were like, this is a hypothermia risk.
But the morning of August 10th, she woke up early, hearing a noise she'll probably never relive.
I don't even know how to describe the sound. It was just like this rumbling. The ground was a little bit like, it was deep echo frequency.
Not sure what was going on, she went back to sleep.
And then I woke up, looked out of the tent, and there was like a tidal surge near our tent. We were camping in the tree line, and then the tsunami hit outside the tree line, so it just missed us. The water went under the vestibule of our tent, so there was like seaweed inside the vestibule where we kept our stuff.
Jonathan Landa on the MY Blackwood was even closer to Mother Nature's destruction.
We were anchored in No Name Bay, sort of right across from the entrance to Tracy Arm.
He was the mate, sharing a cabin with the yacht's captain.
We got woken up by just like the anchor chain pulling taut and like hearing but.
The captain telling Landa to come see what he was seeing.
I saw logs flying by the boat at about 10 knots, and then I looked up and I saw a wave coming.
The water coming from miles down the fjord.
What I saw come towards us was about 9-10 feet and looked like a tidal bore. It was just like a wall of water more than a wave, I'd say.
The size greatly diminished from its starting point.
The ocean that day looked as if you had picked up a tray of water and been sloshing it back and forth.
Meanwhile, about 30 miles away in Endicott Arm, Christine Smith and her husband started to notice something was awry.
He had looked out the back window and noticed that the sandbar that we were anchored behind had a lot of water coming over it in a way that was very unusual.
She says she's never seen water pour over this spot in the 20 years they've spent anchoring there.
The water that was coming over was rushing over, kind of like in like a river, like a whitewater river sort of feel, and then spilling into this little bowl that we're anchored into.
That rough water they later learned to be tsunami waves, ending the kayakers' trip.
I lost my boat. It was a quarter mile out, and one of my friends was on a rock, and then the other one was in this bush tree thing.
One kayaker managing to save their first aid kit and a few other necessary supplies.
We had to end the trip there because we lost too many emergency and non-emergency things to be able to have a comfortable trip at that point, which is when we called on the radio.
That call, a pon-pon, less serious than a mayday.
We went to leave, and we heard a pon-pon call from some kayakers.
Landa coming to the rescue with the help of another crew member.
I couldn't really leave the sticks of the boat because I had to get onto this rocky beach, hold the boat there so we didn't get pushed sideways onto it.
Focusing on the task at hand.
Stressful.
There wasn't room for the emotion of the moment.
I could have lost the boat there, like the tender, and gotten stranded up on the beach and been in the same spot they were in. So I was just pretty much focused on keeping the boat safe and getting people aboarded alive and getting them out of there.
It was very humbling, but also very grateful, but a little bit like out of our control at what happened at that point.
Leander then took the kayakers up Tracy Arm.
We did not know it came out of there yet. We had thought it came out of Endicott, actually.
Not aware that's where 84 million cubic yards of rock had fallen into the water just hours earlier.
There was definitely a lot of debris, like something definitely happened that was not in our control.
There were, I'd say, hundreds of thousands of trees in the water.
Huge icebergs.
There were ones that were over 100 foot and like taller than 30 foot.
Taking in the beauty of Tracy Arm after Mother Nature tried to destroy it. Turning around at Sawyer Island.
But at that point we were kind of, it was a weird mindset to go into Tracy Arm at that point. We were in awe of the beauty of Alaska because we finally like went up a glacier, but we were also grieving for the point that we lost our trip at that point and we weren't able to complete it.
2 survivors say they made decisions that may have saved their lives, leaving a lasting impact on Calvi.
Still pretty wild, even though it's been multiple months. It still is in my heart. I still think about it. The fact that there's more articles coming out now and then reading how big it actually was kind of puts it into reality.
Making a difference in the way she lives her life.
The way that I look at people and just being more intentional on how I want to live my life every morning when I wake up, because you never know how it's going to end.
Smith and her crew discussing what could have been.
We spent a lot of time talking about, was it survivable? What could have we done different? And how are we gonna approach Tracy Arm and Endicott Arm and all these places in the future?
Calvi, leaving an overall thought.
Listen to your gut.
Calvi says the other boat in the general area, the National Geographic Venture, found her kayak about 15 days later and got it back to her. She says it was damaged, but she plans to start fixing it soon. That National Geographic boat was in Tracy Arm while the event was happening, but based on first-hand account published in a scientific paper, it reported only minor effects from the wave. Calvi and Smith both say the outcome of their decisions had to do with luck.
I think we did get really lucky, and some of that was those individual little decisions.
Scientists like Ezgi Karasosin with the Alaska Earthquake Center and geologist Brentwood Higman have studied the event and echoed the sentiment about the situation as a whole.
We were quite lucky with Tracy Arm. No one was harmed. If it were to happen on a Saturday morning, 10 a.m., 12 p.m. or something, it would be disastrous.
We like to have these happen at times when people don't want to be out there. But I do feel like we've gotten awful lucky, and depending on continuing to get lucky is not a good idea.
And just days later, a couple scientists flew over the remnants of the hillside and saw the scope of the damage in Tracy Arm. They helped get eyes on the situation and confirm exactly where it was, saying they may have been some of the first people to look closely.
In my job with the Alaska Volcano Observatory for 20-something years, I've seen a lot of cool things from helicopters, and this was right up there with any of the coolest I've seen.
A sunny August morning, attentive eyes in the sky saw how the energy from the landslide and tsunami changed the Earth's anatomy.
You couldn't miss the big chunk of the mountain that had fallen off and kind of landed mostly on the glacier and partially in the water.
Geophysicist Cyrus Reed had an idea of what he would see on the northern side of the fjord, where the land had let go from the rock beneath it. But he had no idea what the southern side of the fjord would look like, where the tsunami had climbed into the forest.
The wave had run up to 1,500-ish feet, and that, I think, kind of took us aback. We knew that there was likely a splash on the other side, but we didn't realize how big it was.
That wave, estimated to be only a few hundred feet shy of the tallest recorded tsunami.
Nothing like that, no. I've seen, like I said, other stuff, but nothing quite like a 1,500-foot splash wave.
The trees in the water's powerful path forever altered.
We could see where the alders had all their bark peeled off, and so we kind of got an estimate for how high up that splash on the opposite side of the landslide was.
And the evidence of the wave was not confined.
The way that the wave ran up in different places was really interesting, and the extent to which it ran up when it was even pretty far away from the source of the wave itself. That too was striking to me.
This, a reminder of the Earth's power.
You really realize that the Earth is dynamic. It changes all the time. It feels sort of solid and stationary to us, but it's not.
Still ahead, Tracy Arm remains under threat.
I think the concern about a further event there is quite serious.
And some people are choosing not to go into the fjord.
This is real. It's affecting lots of lives already.
The landslide detection program scientists are working on.
We have lots of slopes to worry about.
Plus, the Tracy Arm area is not the only place in Alaska causing apprehension.
It's becoming a common hazard in Alaska.
Details on the other landslides that have created tsunamis in Alaska, and a closer look at some that may.
In my opinion, I would not want to get anywhere close to there with especially a big passenger vessel full of people.
The concern is not over for a fjord that previously had been filled with summer cruise ships and countless smaller boats. The massive wall of rock falling into Tracy Arm was not enough to end the threat. There's more rock that could fall.
In this specific case, the bottom of the slope fell and it left this really precarious chunk up at the top. It's a little smaller than what failed, but it's also higher. So the amount of energy contained in that is very high. So I think the concern about a further event there is quite serious.
And there's overall unease for the fjord after such a large event.
I know that there's a part of the material that didn't fail. So like a couple of the landslide for some reason didn't fail, so that could fail. And then with the more glacier retreat, there could be, it's hard to tell.
The 2025 landslide signaled to scientists that the area is unstable. This means it's a risk to choose to be nearby, and everyone should make a choice on their comfort level based on the information scientists are learning. Multiple cruise lines are choosing not to go into Tracy Arm after the landslide happened. Holland America Line and Royal Caribbean, for example, say their ships instead go into Endicott Arm. And a few of those who survived the Tracy Arm natural disaster say they're making the choice to still recreate nearby.
It is concerning that the glaciers are retrieving, and understanding the risks of it is, but I'm not going to live my life in fear, despite with what happened, because that seems unproductive. So I would like to continue to go up there when the time is right.
For a while, we figure like in the times that when we do in the future go in, we'll just go in, go look at the glacier and come back out to sort of reduce the amount of time risk exposure.
While some cruise lines are choosing to stay out of Tracy Arm, the hazard is not limited just to that slope. Similar geology and retreating glaciers cover large areas of southeast and south central Alaska. It begs the question, is staying out of Tracy Arm and visiting other nearby fjords instead enough to avoid the risk of landslides and the tsunamis they could trigger?
I think we're in a bad position right now. I think that there is a concern about there being potentially a tsunami in Endicott Arm, for instance. Our uncertainty is really high, so it's not like I can say, oh yeah, this is definitely going to happen. You know, if you see it happen, then I'll say I told you so. I can't do that. But it does seem like at the simplest level, it seems that these are increasing rapidly.
So we're not going to avoid every fjord, right? It's not the ideal scenario. So it brings us back to how we can utilize like all of this quite new landslide science findings together collectively to get better at monitoring these kind of hazards.
And Kara Sosin is one of the scientists working to monitor landslides like these and develop a landslide detection system. We'll dive into that program, but first...
I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to see these events happening more often.
From Lituya Bay, the tallest tsunami ever recorded.
We can model it most readily, almost like an asteroid event, because it was a single block of rock that fell into the water, and that caused a lot of cascading effects.
To Barry Arm, the one scientists have been focusing on ahead of a possible disaster.
The scale of it is really hard to understand by looking at it.
And others in between.
The best way to describe it, I think, is just somebody took a mountain and cleaved it in half.
Alaska's history when it comes to landslides and possible tsunamis. The Tracy Arm landslide and tsunami is just adding to the number of landslide tsunami events caused by retreating glaciers in Alaska, showing a history of evidence that the danger is ever present in our state. Alaska's always had landslides and tsunamis, and receding glaciers are an added factor that scientists are starting to realize may play a bigger role in Alaska's hazards than they previously knew about. Let's take a look back in time at the events connecting the three different natural phenomenons.
That caused a massive wave that ran up the nearby shore about 1,720 feet.
In 1958, an earthquake caused a landslide in Lituya Bay, Alaska. It triggered a wave that went more than a quarter mile up the fjord's wall, creating the world's tallest recorded tsunami.
My brother was only 8.
The event killing 5 and sparing others who navigated the wave.
There started to be a line of trees and logs that were beginning to form up like a big raft, and they were kind of forcing him out of the bay.
Fast forward to 2015. A larger landslide in Ton Fjord near Yakutat created a smaller tsunami that left a large scar for all to see.
The best way to describe it, I think, is just somebody took a mountain and cleaved it in half.
And less than 5 years after that, a geologist's sister first pointed out a massive landslide in Barry Arm near Whittier.
I was standing on the beach and I was looking across and I'm like, wow, that's a really steep slope.
It has yet to let go, but in a worst-case scenario, a tsunami from it could rival the size of both the Tracy Arm and Lituya Bay events.
And I was like, wow, that's kind of the recipe for disaster that my brother was talking about, like retreating ice, steep slope, instabilities. So I snapped a couple photos.
Those are just some of the notable landslides and tsunamis attributed to receding glaciers.
So that one data set I'm just working on publishing, it has 120 landslides just since 2012, only in Alaska. And they're all over 1 million cubic meters, which is small compared to Tracy Arm, but it's quite large. And because there have been so many of these, I can start talking about them as a group rather than getting caught in all the fine details of one or two events.
Scientists are studying others in the state.
People choose to take risks, and I think that's a fine choice to make. I think it's important that people recognize that spending time in Portage Valley is taking a risk.
Like the Portage Lake landslide, which, similar to Barry Arm, is slowly sliding down the fjord wall and threatens to create a tsunami with deadly force.
This seems to be a common theme, especially with there are these landslides like Portage Lake, you said Barry Arm, that we know that are like slowly failing, right? We know that there's a risk there.
But that wasn't the case with Tracy Arm. It gave no warning.
We had no clue. There are no indications, as far as I know, that it was going to fail from the slope itself. Yes, the glacier retreat was rapid, and a couple of days earlier than the landslide. Yes, there were precursors. So there are things that we weren't tracking before.
And as glaciers retreat, more landslide-triggered tsunamis could hit Alaska's coastline.
Alaska has beautiful fjords, really nice glaciers that are retreating, like a very dynamic landscape. So I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to see these events happening more often.
Scientists know this now.
I think the challenge is that there's not just one part of Alaska that we are worried about.
But the problem is so vast. How do they know where to look next? Barry Arm is heavily studied, but is that where our biggest concern should be right now?
So I think Barry is a serious concern. I think that studying it is justified, and that if the work that's being done there might well have serious benefits. Is it the very, very tippy top of the scale? I'm not sure it is.
As they work on the landslide detection program, a first step toward monitoring and the possibility of a warning system sometime in the future.
I think that if we are just picking a few sites, we're most likely going to be embarrassed again, like we were at Tracy Arm.
Using today's events to get prepared for tomorrow.
We learn things from focusing on a single event. But we're now able to start comparing large collections of them.
Higgs says what is happening ties to a hypothesis called debuttressing.
The idea is, oh, the glacier's sitting there, it's pressing against the mountain, so it's helping support it. When the glacier retreats, maybe the mountain fails. And I think we're fairly confident that at some level that's right. The coincidence is extremely strong as one thing. We just see over and over again these failures happen very much in the place where the most dramatic retreat is happening for a given glacier. There are a few things, though, that don't quite hold together there. For instance, if you look at the singular glaciers that have the greatest thinning, that have thinned like 2,000 feet, there's actually not that many landslides there. There are other glaciers, they're also retreating, but the retreat seems much less dramatic, and there's huge numbers of landslides. So we're trying to put this stuff together, and this is what has led us to this idea that maybe the important thing is not just how much it's retreating, but also when it retreats to the point where it's exposing slopes that haven't had a chance to have landslides before.
He says if that theory is correct, it would be useful because they can start doing the science to figure out at what point exposed slopes become unstable and dangerous to people nearby.
We do think that there is this strong association with glacial retreat and thus with climate change leading to glacial retreat. But it may be a little more particular than what we initially thought, and we maybe will actually zero in on which glaciers and when they will be most at risk.
The 1958 Lituya Bay event is just one example of glacial retreat being linked to a landslide-triggered tsunami in Alaska. There was an approximately magnitude 7.8 earthquake on the Fairweather Fault in southeast Alaska, and it triggered the massive landslide to fall into Lituya Bay and create the world's tallest tsunami.
40 million cubic yards of material, more or less as a coherent block, fell about 1,000 feet into Lituya Bay. And when that rock hit the water, not only did the rock hit the water, but it took some air with it, and that caused a massive wave that ran up the nearby shore about 1,720 feet. So a mix of the earthquake triggering a landslide and the water conditions there being just right created that gigantic wave.
That wave was so massive, and I'm here in downtown Anchorage to give you a perspective on its height. This building behind me is the ConocoPhillips building. It stands at 296 feet and is the tallest building in Anchorage. The tsunami in Lituya Bay reached 1,720 feet. That's almost 6 ConocoPhillips buildings. Lituya Bay is in southeast Alaska. It's a T-shaped bay with a narrow opening. If you entered the bay before the 1958 tsunami, you could see many lines of different age trees that show a glimpse at past waves' impacts to the land. As you continue through the waters, toward the back of the bay, there's glaciers to your right and to your left, in either sides of the points of the T. Under those glaciers is the Fairweather Fault, a powerful fracture in the earth that produced the large quake that sent millions of cubic yards of land from the far wall into the deep water of Lituya Bay.
The cliff that 1,700-foot wave washed up on was just directly across the water, so it was extremely close, and that's why we got such big splashing run-ups.
USGS geologist Don Miller is one of the main scientists who researched the event. He visited the bay within hours of the destruction. The journal of notes he took that day had one haunting line. In Lituya Bay, the destruction is unbelievable. Salisbury says the tsunami is a pinpoint extreme that made its biggest impact inside the bay.
What we do know is that that rock fell over 1,000 yards or so into the water. And so we can model it most readily, almost like an asteroid event, because it was a single block of rock that fell into the water. And that caused a lot of cascading effects.
Among the survivors were Howard Ulrich and his 8-year-old boy, Sonny. Howard did interviews with BBC and National Geographic about that deadly day before he passed in 2014. We've used his words, but another reporter's voice to help us relive the day.
The date was July the 9th, 1958. We came into Lituya Bay around 8 o'clock in the evening.
That's my brother and my father.
Howard's son and Sonny's brother Bruce is helping bring their story back to life.
My brother was only 8.
We went into our favorite anchoring spot and dropped our anchor and made supper. And finally, about 9 o'clock, we went to our bunks.
And that's when the magnitude 7.8 quake hit, nearly 45 miles away.
There was a slight pause. I thought that everything was over, but some movement up there caught my attention out of the corner of my eye. And so I looked directly up there, and what I observed was like an atomic explosion. Of this big splash came a huge wave. It looked just like a big wall of water.
In the same interview, Sonny says his dad threw him a life preserver and told him to start praying.
Just coal black and full of logs, just straight up and down. It was actually a pretty horrifying looking sight. I just thought, you know, this is how it ends. No way you're gonna get out of this.
He charged into the wave with the boat because his anchor was hung up on the bottom.
Started pulling all the anchor chain out, and when it got to the end of the chain, I thought it was gonna pull the bow of the boat under, but it snapped the chain just like it wasn't even there.
He got the boat over the top of the wave, and he didn't get washed up on shore. Did his job.
I looked down over the stern of the boat, and we were looking down at the trees, and I figured that's where we're gonna end up.
And he was just trying to do whatever he could to keep the boat pointed into the wave.
I had never heard or seen anything like this. It was unbelievable. I couldn't imagine what could have caused anything. I just kept wondering what mechanism could cause something like that.
Even with the force of the world's largest recorded tsunami, Howard navigated the boat through the water that was sloshing on all sides of the bay.
Once he had established that he was safe, he was trying to look for those other boats in the bay, and he had to run around all those backwash spouts that were slapping up 20, 30 feet or something in the air. And then, there, of course, there started to be a line of trees and logs that were beginning to form up like a big raft, and they were kind of forcing him out of the bay.
It was later learned that one of the other boats, the Sunmore, was swamped near the bay's entrance. It went down with Orville and Mickey Wagner on board. They were never found. Mr. and Mrs. William Swanson, who were aboard the Badger, survived.
My father knew them, of course. They were all fishermen.
3 others were killed that night. They were on an island closer to Yakutat. No one knows for sure what happened, but a UAF Geophysical Institute article says Gene Walton and Mr. and Mrs. Robert Tibbles were last seen on Montauk Island shores. The ground is thought to have collapsed beneath them. There were no witnesses, but minutes later, some saw the area that was land moments ago, now covered by water. The Tibbles boat was later found submerged near where they were last seen. While Bill Swanson miraculously survived this deadly tsunami in Lituya Bay, the place that almost took his life is where he would die nearly 4 years later. His obituary in Alaska Sportsman shows he died of a heart attack on his boat near the entrance of Lituya Bay. Ketchikan Sit News says it's the first time he had been back to the bay.
Alaska's coastlines are hazardous, and if you enjoy them, which we all do, then you do put yourself at a calculated risk. And so it's important to be prepared, know the natural warning signs of earthquakes, landslides, and tsunamis, and to be prepared for the worst. Because as you pointed out, we have seen the worst in Alaska before.
1958 wasn't the first time a large wave was created in Lituya Bay. It's happened multiple times before.
They were not as large as the 1958 tsunami.
Scientists think there were 4 other instances stretching from the mid-1800s to mid-1900s. Eyewitness accounts and evidence from the grounds around Lituya Bay indicate there were disastrous large waves in 1853 or 1854, 1874, 1899, and 1936.
Most of the evidence associated with them, like scars on the banks and cut trees, when folks arrived, they saw that there were different zones of tree heights. And so the most recently cleared areas had the shortest trees. But in 1958, most of that evidence was obliterated because it was larger.
Multiple devastating waves in about a century. That's a lot. Salisbury says there are absolutely concerns that another destructive wave will come from Lituya Bay, but scientists say the probability of repeating the event is relatively low.
The earthquakes in that part of the world will continue to happen. The likelihood for more large waves is almost inevitable.
Salisbury says the Fairweather Fault under Lituya Bay's glaciers moves extremely fast.
The combination of the geologic factors, including Fairweather Fault, as well as the potential for major rainstorms to trigger landslides, combined with deep fjordland water, the deepest water in Lituya Bay is about 700 feet. All those combined make the chances of another tsunami very likely.
Several of the factors in the Lituya Bay event are already in play in Barry Arm. There's a mountainside in Prince William Sound where about 850 million cubic yards of land only has a soft grip on the earth beneath it, as it threatens to create a wave that could rival the size of the run-up of the world's tallest tsunami. News of the landslide's discovery was released in May 2020. The land sits high above the deep water, slowly creeping down Barry Arm's fjord wall.
We've learned that it does experience periods of movement.
It hasn't let go, but it's been losing its grip as scientists watch it very closely. What's it like to go to places like Barry Arm and see the massive landslides just towering over the water?
It's overwhelming. The scale of it is really hard to understand by looking at it. The landscape is massive, the landslide itself is very large, and it's just an overwhelming place to be.
Scientists say the biggest show of force would likely be in Barry Arm itself. In a worst-case scenario, the land could hit the fjord and push water more than 1,600 feet up the walls of Barry Arm.
The biggest concern we have is just the uncertainty that we have in when the landslide itself would fail, and the fact that we may or may not see precursors to that failure.
The landslide was once held up by Barry Glacier, but in recent years, it's been quickly receding, leaving the large landmass with nothing to support it.
And so this could happen unexpectedly, and when it does happen, there's very little lead time from the failure of the landslide to when it could potentially impact those nearby and in nearby communities.
The landslide and the tsunami it has the potential to trigger was first thought to be a big hazard to nearby Whittier. Initially, scientists thought a 30-foot wave could hit the coastal town, but new research came with a downgraded worst-case scenario.
In science, and especially in modeling, there's a large degree of uncertainty, and it's up to us and scientists to better understand the models, their strengths and weaknesses, to evaluate which one is more accurate. The current model that we're using has been developed and vetted by researchers at the USGS, and is one that we have a high degree of confidence in.
It says a smaller wave could be recorded in the Whittier area, but scientists still warn it could create damage to the town and a life-threatening situation to anyone in the area of the slide. Scientists have spent countless hours studying just what might happen if the Barry Arm landslide falls in a catastrophic way.
We looked into the worst-case scenario and what would happen if the whole landslide failed. And based on those tests, we expect that a 7-foot tsunami wave would reach Whittier about 25 minutes after the landslide hit the water.
USGS research civil engineer Katie Barnhart says that means the water level around Whittier could rise 7 feet after the landslide hits water.
The tsunami wave that we simulate in the worst case scenario basically fills up the harbor almost to the top of the seawall, which is why you don't see a lot of inundation inland of the seawall. And although this tsunami likely wouldn't cause extensive flooding in Whittier, there could be currents in shallow water that could still be quite dangerous.
While the current model doesn't predict major flooding in Whittier, Barnhart says it's still important to get to high ground if there's a tsunami warning.
If you see or hear any signs of a potential tsunami, something like a loud roar, an earthquake, unusual ocean behavior, you won't know if that's because the Barry Arm landslide has failed or if another landslide somewhere else, potentially closer by, has failed. And so the best thing to do in that circumstance is to seek higher ground.
The threat looming in Barry Arm isn't a normal landslide for scientists. This time, they can see it coming.
The reason it comes up as being really worrisome when we see something moving like that is that we know in other places where there were huge landslides that they typically moved, the mountains moved like that before they failed. So it kind of creeps along, and then something happens, which we don't understand very well. Something happens and then it fails catastrophically.
Geologist Barrett Salisbury says scientists don't know if or when the landslide will disastrously fall into the water.
What we don't know about Barry Arm is whether or not that is going to fail all at once, all 650 million cubic yards, or whether it will be pieces that happen on the same day or decades apart or hundreds of years apart. We just don't know enough about the structure yet to make those kinds of estimates.
While the slide is concerning to scientists, they haven't sounded the alarm.
There are certain signs that would cause us to be more concerned than we are now.
He says that could include more of the slide moving or parts of it moving more quickly.
We're always concerned about earthquakes and prolonged rainfall. When we see different combinations of those factors, that would certainly raise our level of concern.
About 30 miles from the Barry Arm landslide, there's another wall of rock sitting above deep water that's concerning to scientists.
Tearing the bedrock apart, it's quite dramatic. You see, these huge cracks opening up in the ground. The clock may be ticking especially loudly right there, right now.
There's concerns part of the hillside could fall into the lake, creating a tsunami that could be nearly 50 feet tall when it reaches the area of the Baggage Bogs Visitor Center. I talked with scientists about this in 2024 and followed up on the situation recently.
Kind of above the front of the glacier, if you were looking at the glacier on the right, this slope on the right has started crumbling, and a lot of it is moving slowly downward.
A slow-moving landslide towering above Portage Lake is a cause of concern for scientists.
That area is very broken up. The bedrock is tearing itself apart.
Like geologist Brentwood Higman.
Parts of it are falling off abruptly, but they've been small parts so far, and the worry is that a big chunk could come loose, and if that hit the water, it could generate a tsunami in the lake that could be very large.
Higg says there's still a lot to learn about the situation, but he's been studying it since 2022.
It's the sort of mass that could produce a tsunami that would be many hundreds of feet tall in some places, and certainly tens of feet tall throughout the margin of the lake. And so that's why we're really worried about it. It is big. We could, is it record-breaking in the world? Definitely not. Is it bigger than most landslides you encounter? Definitely.
Geologist Mort Larson agrees the slide warrants close eyes.
There's concern. That's a major corridor system. It's a recreational system. So it's definitely something that people need to pay attention to, but something that needs to be observed and monitored to a certain degree.
Higg is also concerned about the risk to nearby infrastructure, including the tunnel into Whittier, the highway, rail lines, and power lines.
Some very bad cases would involve something that would sweep all the way down the valley, would endanger everything in Portage Valley.
The Chugach National Forest says it learned of the hazard in 2023 and has been working to understand more about the evolving science since then.
The science is still very young, and we're learning more and more about this hazard weekly and monthly, really.
Graham Prediger with the Chugach National Forest says the agency has developed an emergency plan.
We're taking a risk-based approach to this hazard, and as we see conditions aligning that may increase the risk, then we're proactively taking action to move folks out of the visitor center and out of the bunkhouse.
And has information on the Willowa Campground and Baggage Bogs Visitor Center web pages.
As we learn more, again, we're prepared to communicate responsibly to the public about this hazard so they can make their own decisions and accept the risk of coming out to the valley or not.
but there is no physical signage at this point.
It's a balance between being an alarmist and communicating responsibly and effectively to the public.
September 2025, the Chugach National Forest sent out messages around the time rockfall activity from the landslide was reported. And while there was a large rain event in the area, which could make the landslide more likely to let go,
we made the decision to proactively close the visitor center and move folks out of there. But that's sort of an example of how we're proactively looking at the science and looking at this hazard to make decisions.
It was closed again in July of this year.
Decision makers on the forest decided to implement our emergency action plan on Sunday morning, July 19th, to proactively close the visitor center just for the day while the peak of this atmospheric river event came through South Central Alaska.
Rockfall activity was reported again around the same time of the closure.
It doesn't sound like it was that big of rockfall. It's just kind of that whole slope is continually sloughing.
Prediger says he feels the appropriate action is being taken right now as they monitor the site with the help of other agencies and make risk-based decisions.
Bottom line, this is it's a low probability, high consequence problem. These are difficult problems to manage. It's not a matter of when this thing is going to slide. It is a big if at this point.
Higgs says the tsunami modeling still needs more work for scientists to understand exactly where the water would go. But he's sure there's a risk.
Reality is that the visitor center is at risk and that the valley is at risk. I have high confidence in that.
Higgs says there was a significant landslide in April 2024 and another one in September 2025.
This one actually went straight into the water, but apparently was moving slow enough it didn't generate a big tsunami. I suspect if you had instruments recording it, you would find there was some kind of tsunami, but I think it didn't do any harm.
He called the 2025 landslide big, but says it was far smaller than something like the Tracy Arm landslide. And like Prediger said, rockfall activity was also reported in July of this year. There's not a timeline on when the slide could come down or if it will come down in a worst case scenario. And he says to some, the risk might be worth it to recreate in the area.
People choose to take risks, and I think that's a fine choice to make. I think it's important that people recognize that spending time in Portage Valley is taking a risk.
We know about the Portage Lake landslide now, but there's some landslides that fall without anyone knowing it was even there. On October 17th, 2015, a landslide the size of the one that would later plague Tracy Arm plunged into the water, triggering a large tsunami. This time in Icy Bay's Ton Fjord.
It was just a beautiful, mountain. It's right at the base of Mount St. Elias.
Ton Fjord's steep mountainside let go of 80 million cubic yards of land in October 2015.
It's hard to describe. It's just like truly jaw-dropping, the magnitude, the change.
Icy Bay Lodge fishing guide Michael York was inside the lodge when that massive piece of earth fell into the water, creating a tsunami that splashed more than 600 feet up the fjord walls.
Nothing, could have survived if there was an eyewitness. It's pretty massive. The best way to describe it, I think, is just somebody took a mountain and cleaved it in half. The first year or two afterwards, there was a lot of, you could smell it, like you could smell the earth.
This video from scientists who visited the area about 8 months later shows the scale of destruction. The violent waves took out about 8 square miles of forest.
There's like a perfect line of trees that just disappeared, peninsulas wiped clean, and then the actual, scar on the mountain. It's just something that if you don't see in person, it's hard to describe. It was like our own little Lituya Bay, I guess.
That barely scratches the surface of the 1958 Lituya Bay tsunami's run-up, but it has an interesting story behind it, and it helps build knowledge of landslide triggering tsunamis. While York was inside Icy Bay Lodge, when the land fell into the fjord, 2 moose hunters were standing outside.
I remember them running in and saying, "Man, there's something going on out here. It's loud." But it had been raining, it was windy, and just the worst southeast weather for like all month.
He brushed it off. He didn't think anything of it, until months later, when a scientist called to ask about the geologic event.
And let us know that there had been an event. And I said, oh, yeah, okay, maybe. But otherwise, we never would have known.
These are just a few of the landslides tied to glacial retreat that have been identified, but there's others that have fallen over the years. Let's look at a timeline of significant events since Lituya Bay's largest landslide in 1958. About a decade later, there was a similar scenario in Grink Lake outside of Homer, creating a tsunami that had a run-up of only 200 feet. Flash forward to 2015, it happened again. This time, it was in Ton Fjord. Since then, the Barrier Arm landslide was discovered around 2020 and Portage Lake around 2021. And 2 large landslides let go in 1 year. In 2024, both the Surprise Glacier and Pedersen Glacier Lagoon events happened. Near Seward on August 7th, 6 million cubic yards of land fell onto Pedersen Glacier and into the lagoon, causing a tsunami with a run-up of about 56 feet. And on September 20th, about 10 miles from the Barrier Arm landslide, 3 large landslides fell onto the glacier and partly into the water within an hour, the largest being about 3 million cubic yards. And they created a tsunami that was small by the time it made it to the nearest tide gauge. And the next notable event was in Tracy Arm in 2025, which we learned created the world's second tallest tsunami.
Tracy Arm, I'd given it a quick look. Theoretically, me and many of my colleagues were trying to prepare for that event, but we didn't flag that one until it happened. And I think if we are focused on just a few sites, that we're likely to over and over again be looking at the wrong ones, because these things are pretty hard to predict. So that's where I want to spread out a little more, have more monitoring out there, try to understand better where these things will happen. And I think that could really help people.
When you were looking at Tracy Arm before it happened, what was your overall thought on that fjord?
So I was looking for slow landslides. So this would be something like what's at Barrier Arm, like what's at Portage. Those are definitely a risk factor. I've actually come to appreciate that maybe we shouldn't focus so much on those. And Tracy Arm is a great example of why. We sometimes see slopes fail catastrophically that don't have a slow landslide before. And that was the case at Tracy Arm. But one thing I did see there is there was a landslide in the 1990s. And I found a historic, or like an account of it. And I found where it was on the map and mapped it out. And I'm like, okay, that's worth noting, and looked around, didn't find anything else, and moved on. I was not thinking, maybe I should watch this South Sawyer Glacier really closely and check on, even once a year, just be like, is it doing in kind of unusual retreat pattern? That was not what I was doing. Now I would like to be, doing that with all of the glaciers that are in that situation where there's a lot of people present, which is actually not a crazy long list. This isn't like I need to be watching 1,000 glaciers. This is more like 30 glaciers are enough. And just satellite images just once every, say, few months, I would really like to be doing that. And I was not doing that at Tracy Arm.
When we come back, scientists are working to get ahead of the hazard.
This effort started with the discovery of Barrier Arm hazard a couple of years ago, and our goal is to be able to, detect these landslides in real time.
Plus, landslide preparedness discussions in Congress.
Landslides have been harder. They've been harder to provide for a level of advance warning. But we're making some headway.
Scientists and lawmakers weigh in on the efforts to keep people safe when the next big one happens.
I guess my opinion is that we should pay very close attention to that pattern. When you see a glacier retreats, then seems to stabilize, then retreats again.
Scientists are working hard to understand what leads up to events like what happened in Tracy Arm, and to learn what they can from landslides they know about now. Whether they've let go or if they're still holding on, but slowly sliding down the fjord wall, as they look for a potential solution to help you stay safe while you're in remote Alaska. It's a project that's been in the works for years, and it was originally focused on one area of the state.
There are lots of reports by lots of other agencies is that Barrier Arm is not the only landslide we should be concerned about.
The landslide detection algorithm was first built for that landslide in Prince William Sound.
Thanks to the seismic network we have in Alaska, we quickly realized this can be expanded to cover more region.
It was expanded just days before the Tracy Arm landslide, but not yet to that part of Alaska. And that's the next step scientists want to take.
So it's probably a good motivation to do that. And another motivation to continue doing this kind of research and monitoring for sure.
Despite the algorithm not being active in the Tracy Arm area, scientists used the algorithm to figure out exactly what happened and where.
It's really good that our landslide detection algorithm was successful in pinpointing the location of this event and also coming up with a size estimate. We will be developing that code and then hopefully expanding into areas like Tracy Arm.
And what happened in Tracy Arm may have given scientists an idea.
It's telling us a lot.
Into what kind of clues could precede this kind of landslide.
The precursory seismic activity before the landslide, the rapid glacier retreat, the rain, although it wasn't the main trigger. So there are like lots of clues that we were able to figure out after the fact that it's happened.
A portion of South Sawyer Glacier retreated, exposing part of the base of the slope that would fail just days before the landslide let go.
It has a history of kind of episodic retreat. So it will retreat really rapidly, and then it gets kind of stable. It's still thinning very slowly, but the face stays in the same place, and then falls back again. So this happened in 2004. It went through a rapid retreat in 2004. Then it stabilized. And then in 2016, it retreated really rapidly, stabilized again. In late summer 2024, it started falling back a little bit. And then winter comes on, so it recovered a bit. But as soon as 2025 got warming up, it started retreating really quickly.
He says he's seen this with other places, like Barry Arm, and right now with Portage Glacier.
Kind of a remarkable coincidence if you think that's random. So I think that these patterns of like episodic retreat are maybe good predictors, and that we should be especially attentive when a glacier seems to be stable and then it starts retreating quickly.
But what does this information that we may only be able to connect now because of the Tracy Arm event mean for detecting landslides in the future?
That's the question now all of us are wondering.
She says, as far as scientists know, not every landslide has precursors like this.
We can't rely on this kind of precursory activity.
But they're now looking back to see what they can learn from it.
It won't be saying like, hey, tomorrow there will be a landslide in Tracy Arm. It would probably say, there's something going on in this region, in like a broader region around Tracy Arm or in that part, that seems to be unstable for, let's say, 10 days. So that would be hopefully a warning like that, but we are far away from it.
Still to come, survivors from the Tracy Arm event pitch ideas they would like to see scientists look into.
Is there a way for us to get like extra alerting on our Garmin's or phones?
And an effort to get ahead of the curve.
It's not easy because in hindsight, all things are clear.
Lawmakers and scientists chime in on what's next. It's important to remember that not every glacier is a concern, and not every landslide will cause a mega tsunami. This is why sharing information in terms of safety is tricky. But again, events are uncommon, but when they happen, they can be dangerous. When looking at the run-up that deems a tsunami to be the tallest in the world, the geology in the area makes a big difference. Hake explained further while talking about the Tracy Arm event.
This run-up number, it's great for a headline, right? But it is very dependent on the exact geometry of where you are. So at Portage, for instance, if we got, let's say we had a really bad event there and it was a relatively large tsunami, well, the way it would be pointed would be towards Portage Pass. It's not going to reach, 2,000 feet there and beat Lituya Bay, just because the geometry is a little different.
And not all glaciers in Alaska are receding, and not all of the ones that are creating the right formula for landslides. Even so, it's critical to pay attention.
This hazard is real. It's becoming more and more frequent.
Scientists shared their biggest takeaways from the Tracy Arm event after months of studying it. Karasosin says the way scientists communicate with the public and hears the needs from the community is essential.
It requires lots of agencies to work together, as we are doing now, and then being more active on that front is my biggest takeaway.
I think our opportunity right now would be to get a little more ahead of the curve. It's not easy because in hindsight, all things are clear, but if we want to actually have foresight, boy, it's tough. But I really, that's the biggest thing for me. How do we do that?
And how we do it is a question many are trying to answer. Lawmakers and government agencies have these landslides on their radar and are working to help give scientists more resources to assess landslide hazards around the country. The Tracy Arm landslide was one of the largest magnitude landslides in the last 30 years globally, and it has the second highest run-up of any recorded tsunami.
It all means that we need to work on it and then come up with lots of techniques to monitor this hazard. This is real. It's affecting lots of lives already.
I think everything that we can do to, again, better understand the conditions that are bringing about more of these deadly and destructive landslides, so that we can be better prepared. Everything that we can do for that is important.
Senator Lisa Murkowski has focused on natural disasters for years and has served as a member of the Senate Disasters Caucus.
I think it takes a passion for understanding what we're dealing with here in Alaska.
In early 2021, the National Landslide Preparedness Act became law. And in 2025, Murkowski was one of the senators to introduce a bill to reauthorize it.
People are made aware of the potential for a tsunami, perhaps following an earthquake, because of the warning system that we have. Landslides have been harder. They've been harder to provide for a level of advance warning, but we're making some headway, and we needed to, because we have seen far too many deadly disasters from landslides.
Jonathan Gott with the USGS Landslide Hazards Program said in 2022 that after the Barry Arm landslide was found, federal lawmakers authorized funding for agencies in Alaska to help monitor unstable slopes around Barry Arm and study landslide hazards in the Prince William Sound area.
That authorizing legislation provides, in essence, a bully pulpit, right, to speak to those issues.
He says agencies have used the appropriations to install instruments so they can better monitor the landslide's movement and other indications it may be moving in a concerning way. Dave Snyder with the National Tsunami Warning Center in Palmer says for Barry Arm, there's an alerting process that is expected to trigger a wireless emergency alert on phones if the landslide creates a tsunami. Do you think we're doing enough?
No, I don't. It's always a matter of funding, right? And it's not just a simple line item appropriation that goes to USGS, for instance, for the tsunami early warning or earthquake early warning or landslide, because everything relies on data, right?
Natural hazards are a normal part of living life anywhere.
I think some of what we need to do is we need to inform in a way that can be that is important for awareness without paralyzing people so that they don't even want to go outside.
The Lituya Bay landslide killed 2 people and 4 survived. The Ton Fjord and Tracy Arm events left scars in Alaska's geology, but no one was injured. The Barry Arm and Portage Lake landslides have the potential to create death and destruction. But experts say making choices about the amount of time you spend in the danger zone is a way of taking the risk into your own hands.
Now that we know these events are happening more often, there's these precursor signals. I hope we'll have more people working on these type of research that's actually looking into these kind of signals and then figure out ways to warn people or monitor. So I think that's what's next for us.
Those who survived the Tracy Arm event are sharing their thoughts on what could have helped them in the moment.
I would love it if scientists would have a chance to really study what the area is like, maybe how the rocks are. I'm not really sure what they can offer and what they would want to offer. And so I think most of it would probably be funding for more monitoring would be my big ask.
We weren't in hearing shot of the VHF radio. I don't know if there was a warning that we would have been awake, to be honest. So, and how early could you warn us? Could you let me know 10 days in advance? And then maybe I won't be there. But from a practical standpoint, I don't know what they can do, really. I think these things happen in wild, untamed places.
Is there a way for us to get like extra alerting on our Garmin's or phones? But it's also so hard to do that if you don't have any service. Like we get Amber Alerts on our phones, but if there's a way for if there was an emergency like that, but again, it's too fast. Like it's different if the tsunami's happening from the other side of the Pacific Ocean, but it's another story if it's a localized just like land falling down.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Fault in the Facts. It's an important story about a hazard present in Alaska, so you can make decisions on how you want to recreate. On our website, we have more details on the Tracy Arm event, as well as stories that go into more detail on the Lituya Bay, Berry Arm, and Tonfjord landslides and tsunamis. Watch about the unexpected way 2 of those landslides were discovered.
I saw logs flying by the boat at about 10 knots, and then I looked up and I saw a wave coming.
There was some water coming underneath the vestibule of our tent.
Landslide just sheared that part of the glacier right off.
You know, how cats have 9 lives, that we may have used up one of our 9 lives.
In this specific case, the bottom of the slope fell and it left this really precarious chunk up at the top.
We were quite lucky with Tracy Arm, and no one was harmed. If it were to happen on a Saturday morning, 10 a.m., 12 p.m. or something, it would be disastrous.
That one data set I'm just working on publishing, it has 120 landslides just since 2012, only in Alaska.
This seems to be a common theme.
I think if we are focused on just a few sites, that we're likely to over and over again be looking at the